One more disclaimer. The opinions expressed by Adam Sternbach in this episode are solely his own opinions and not that of Tessera and are not considered legal advice.
Some of the conversations I've actually had with policymakers in my role, and specifically on a state level, is about trying to craft digital financial literacy. And I feel like that is a really interesting concept that the industry could do more with to kind of help people understand both digital identity and how to transact generally online, but specifically as it pertains to crypto and safeguarding assets and kind of being smart about wallets and using wallets where you sign messages or interact with other types of smart contracts relative to just having kind of the hot wallet, cold wallet, vaulted wallet, like those general types of concepts, is something that I think becomes a pretty interesting conversation and consideration about digital financial literacy as well.
So you're talking about this with policymakers at a federal level or at a local level?
More at a state level, just kind of conceptually. I think one of the things, and a lot of my time lately is spent on general NFT and crypto policy work. And in the absence, and we can certainly get into this more, but in the absence of kind of federal legislation and federal policymaking to provide some level of rules and clarity for the industry, states have stepped into the role where they are trying to introduce bills that are more or less, with certain nuances, but for the sake of this conversation, very similar to the bit license in New York that was implemented several years ago, where it kind of creates a licensing regime a little bit more broad, and I think in ways that people don't understand than bit license, but the same kind of idea where states are basically stepping in to fill a gap in consumer protection that they view within the crypto industry in the absence of federal clarity and regulation.
Yeah, that's, to me, is top of mind, right? As I think a lot of people in this industry, which is like, there really is no consumer protection right now. It's, very much like, you are autonomous now. You must be beholden to whatever security risks and stuff. And frankly, that's going to keep this industry small, right? Which, to some people is okay, but the mission with this show is like, how do we take this mainstream? Because you see all the value, all the upside, all this creative unlock, all this incentive alignment, all this ability to connect with people and build communities around this. Like that truly can't have its day unless there are hundreds of millions of people here, in my opinion. And they're not going to come if they have to worry about figuring out how to get a little USB stick, call it a cold wallet, right, and like store a seed phrase and like put it in a vault and then connect it to your Discord. Like that's too complicated. So a lot of that has to change. And I worry in some instance when you tell me you're talking to the states. I mean, I'm glad that somebody's picking up the slack, but I start to think I have like PTSD from privacy law, where, we wouldn't adopt a federal privacy law. And now we've got CCPA, and now there's other states that are adopting these little laws that like really don't make much sense. And there's no unification of it, and compliance with them is extremely tough. It sounds like we're heading down that same path.
Yeah, I think in the absence of some kind of holistic federal regulatory structure, states will fill that void. And I think you saw that a while ago with BitLicense. And I think certainly the fall of FTX and the idea, I don't know how much of it's a true reality, but at least the idea that because of the BitLicense, FTX could not operate in New York. I mean, granted, they weren't really operating many places in the US, but nonetheless, I think New York regulators, to their credit perhaps, kind of glommed on to like, oh, no New York residents could have been hurt by this because they weren't licensed and able to, let alone the fact that they weren't really in any US states, putting aside FTX US and those types of things. But the type of risk that I guess FTX presented and the ultimate reality of how that situation played out have given, I think, a greater willingness for states to say, we need to do something to protect our consumers and our residents. And I do think while they will have kind of, state policymaking oftentimes is looking around at what other states, and the federal for that matter too, but states looking around at what other states have done and either borrowing those or iterating on that, but you're rarely reinventing the wheel. And because BitLicense exists, and I think to most state financial regulators, BitLicense has been a pretty good structure and regime, notwithstanding what I think a lot of New York State residents would say, that largely becomes the model to then build off of. And it doesn't appreciate a lot of the nuanced distinctions between crypto. Uh, I view crypto, when people talk about crypto regulation, as somewhat of a monolith, and I think it needs to be much more nuanced and kind of verticalized within centralized exchanges, within DeFi, within NFTs, within token issuances. And I think when people talk about broadly regulating crypto, they don't appreciate those differences. They don't appreciate why different policies are needed for those different areas. And everything kind of gets thrown into the same bucket and creates a pretty unworkable structure. And I'm afraid, to your point, that's where we are headed, absent some efforts to kind of educate and slow that down, which there certainly are. But, you get some gung-ho people in some places who are hell-bent on legitimately what they think is in the best interest of their constituents. It poses a pretty significant challenge.
So when you're having these conversations, are you pointing to other state regulation? Are you pointing to like MICA, the European regulation, anything in Canada, some of that stuff that's been working well?
Yeah, a little bit. I mean, I think you're certainly trying to look at what other jurisdictions have done, just generally try and provide some education around some of these different verticals and why I think there's a very legitimate and good reason to regulate centralized exchanges as kind of custodial intermediaries in the way that a lot of other financial regulation and securities regulation applies to centralized intermediaries like brokers and exchanges and things like that. Um, I think it gets obviously more difficult when you talk about decentralized protocols that are largely non-custodial and connecting people in peer-to-peer transactions, even though it could appear to someone from an outside perspective that it's a very similar structure to a centralized exchange. Obviously, the underlying technology is pretty different. So yeah, I think you're certainly looking at what other jurisdictions have done. You're certainly trying to educate people about some of these nuanced differences. Some people are more open to that conversation than others. From an NFT specific lens, it's certainly trying to explain that a lot of NFTs are digital art or digital collectibles or gaming items or some type of other consumptive asset that in the real world has a parallel that wouldn't necessarily be regulated, but in a digital world, because of effectively like a ready secondary market with a known secondary market price at any given time, becomes much more like something that previously feels like it needs to be regulated. I'd say those are kind of some of the gaps in just trying to bridge some of those gaps in understanding and create at least what has started to come into play for NFTs again specifically is kind of, well, how do we differentiate between financial use case and between consumer use case and things like that? And that's a really good question, and I think certainly worthy of consideration and discussion. But I also think we're at such a nascent stage for NFTs in particular, and frankly, a lot of crypto like DeFi even, where unless you're really willing to like study the issues like they have done in Europe and like they have done in other jurisdictions, the US approach and the state approach, where they even have less resources than at the federal level, becomes very haphazard and kind of forces stuff into different boxes that just really becomes pretty unworkable in practice. And that, I think, is largely the challenge of crypto regulation and how to educate people, get people to come around. There have been a lot of strides made in the last couple of years, certainly, but we still have a long way to go.